Nolan Wells disappeared along a stretch of Mississippi coastline that happens to be one of the most heavily surveilled few miles of water in the state. Docks, a drawbridge, a yacht club, waterfront homes worth millions of dollars, most running their own private security systems, not because of this case, just because that's what modern waterfront property looks like. Nobody built that network to watch for what happened to Nolan Wells. It was already there, pointed at the water, before any of this started. 5 weeks later, there's still no public answer for how much of it has actually been checked. That hasn't stopped people from checking for themselves. Independent locals have spent recent weeks walking the docks and cataloging what's actually out there, camera by camera. Work that isn't official, but is at least verifiable.
So listen to this. It's only 30 seconds, but you need to know and look carefully at the map to know where everything is, okay?
Girl's house that I will call Ava D. Right here in the yellow is where the party was at. You could almost perfectly plot out every dock that they stopped at on this little trip of theirs before they went to the boat dock.
Okay, there's Horn Island right there.
Okay, this is boots on the ground journalism. This is Bree, Jess Bree. She did God's work and went right into the heart of Ocean Springs, the town that sticks together, the town that doesn't let anybody mess with it. And the information she found, she said, let's go through Nolan Wells and the boys' alleged last moments on July 4th, Horn Island, Fort Bayou, and Lover's Lane. Pay attention to what she's saying, all right? Let's go. This is Horn Island.
Looks like there's a sailboat out there, maybe.
Okay.
It's okay in the water.
That's the island. That is how long it is. It is pretty long, guys.
Yeah.
That's the west end, or that's the east end. That's the west end, or that's the east end.
And it's light.
Oh.
And then over here is going to be the west end, and this is the washing machine that they're talking about.
Hold on.
Water is pretty choppy today, but that is the island. There's some houses right there. The next place I'm going to take you to.
A camera is either mounted on that pier or it isn't. Here's what makes the official silence harder to shrug off. Wells didn't disappear anywhere near that surveilled corridor. He vanished on Horn Island, a barrier island with no cell towers and no cameras of any kind. His friends left without him at 4:31 that afternoon, but the boat carrying them didn't go straight home. At 5:52, it turned into that same monitored stretch of water and didn't come back out for 14 minutes. Nobody on board has ever publicly said why. Then the detail that's harder to wave off than the 14 minutes. When that boat reached the dock that night, the group came home with Nolan's phone. They didn't come home with Nolan. This is where it stops being online speculation. The family's attorneys have sent formal evidence preservation demands and filed subpoenas connected to this case. The kind of legal step nobody takes unless they believe something out there is worth preserving before it disappears. And commercial security footage doesn't last forever. Most systems overwrite themselves within 30 to 90 days. The window to pull anything from July 4th was already closing before most people knew to ask. 2 questions, 5 weeks in, neither answered. Has anyone actually gone and pulled footage from that stretch of water, or is it already gone? And what actually happened between the moment Nolan Wells parted ways with his friends and the moment his body turned up, 2 mornings later, alone? If you're new here, drop where you're watching from and subscribe. We're staying on this until there's a real answer. None of that, the cameras, the subpoenas, the questions still sitting unanswered 5 weeks later, existed on the morning of July 4th. That morning, this was just a group of friends getting an early start on a holiday. Nolan Wells was 18. He'd graduated from Ocean Springs High School a year earlier, where he played multiple sports and built the kind of reputation that keeps showing up, unprompted, in how people describe him afterward. Hardworking, humble, easy to be around. His high school principal would later call him a remarkable student and teammate. His coach would say his character spoke louder than his stat sheet ever did. People who've spent years around locker rooms, who've heard every kind of tribute and know which ones are real, kept landing on the same handful of words for Nolan Wells. Genuine, kind, the type of person who wanted everyone else in the room to feel like they belonged there too. Football had taken him to Summit, Mississippi, a few hours inland from home, where he played wide receiver for Southwest Mississippi Community College. He'd signed there the previous February, one of 4 players from his high school class joining the program together, and when a local news crew asked him about the moment, he spent most of the answer talking about his friends making the jump alongside him, not about himself. That instinct, pointing attention somewhere other than himself, showed up again during his recruiting visit to the school, when coaches remembered him spending part of his own big day, making sure his younger brother got noticed too. He was heading into his second season with the team, 6'1", listed at 185 pounds, wearing number 16. In his first college game, he hadn't played a single down, and teammates remember he spent it on the sideline anyway, as fired up about the win as anyone who did play. It's the kind of small detail that means almost nothing on its own, and that people only tend to bring up about someone once he's gone. He was already seen as someone the younger players on the roster looked to. At home, he and his father would sit down together to break down game film, the ordinary rhythm of a family built around Friday nights and long fall Saturdays. By the 4th of July, Nolan was just days from reporting back to campus for practice and summer classes. The trip to Horn Island was, by every account, exactly what it looked like from the outside. One last stretch of summer with the friends he'd grown up with, before the season took over his schedule. Horn Island sits about 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, a barrier island with no permanent residents, long popular for precisely this kind of holiday gathering. Boats anchor together in clusters, people swim and wade in the shallows, and everyone heads home once the sun starts to drop. That's how the day began. A boat left a private dock a little before 10 that morning and reached the island a little past 11. Nolan aboard alongside several friends from high school. By early afternoon, it had turned into a genuinely large gathering. More than 20 people spread across at least 2 boats, marking the holiday the same unremarkable way people up and down the coast were marking it that day. Nothing about those first several hours has ever been described as anything but ordinary. The first sign the day wouldn't end the way it began came from the water itself, not from anything anyone did. Sometime after 4 o'clock, the boat several of Nolan's friends were using started taking on water, and the group decided to head back toward the mainland to deal with it. Nolan didn't go with them. By his friend's account, that wasn't treated as anything unusual at the time. He'd planned to stay a little longer and catch a ride back later with another group. He was, after all, still surrounded by people he knew. What exactly he said in the moments before his friend's boat pulled away is one of the first places this story stops being simple. The accounts of what his plan actually was don't fully agree with each other. Small enough, on its own, to mean almost nothing. It only starts to matter once no one can find him to ask. At 4:31 that afternoon, the boat carrying Nolan's friends left Horn Island without him. He never called. He never texted. As the evening wore on and the holiday traffic on the water thinned out, Nolan didn't turn up at the dock, at anyone's house, anywhere his family checked. Sometime that night, his mother did what any parent would do once the silence went on too long. She reported him missing. That phone call is where the version of this story most people already know actually begins. The search for Nolan Wells lasted more than 40 hours. Boats, aircraft, and search teams worked the waters around Horn Island through the rest of that weekend, covering water that most of the people looking had known their whole lives. Then, on Monday morning, a National Park Service ranger doing a routine patrol found him in the water near the island's northwestern tip. In the first hours after that, the official read on what had happened was cautious, but not especially alarming. The sheriff's office said its detectives were talking to everyone who'd had contact with Nolan that day, and that no foul play had been identified at that point. The coroner, who took custody of his body that same morning, said there were no obvious signs of trauma. Neither statement closed anything. Both were simply where the case stood on day one. A young man, an island, an apparent drowning, and a set of first impressions that hadn't yet been tested against anything. They wouldn't stay untested for long. Within days, Nolan's family had retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump and commissioned their own independent autopsy, separate from the one the state was already conducting. 2 examinations, running in parallel, looking at the same body for the same answer. That alone tells you something about where trust stood between the family and the process meant to give them answers. And it's worth sitting with, rather than rushing past, because almost everything that follows in this case grows out of that same gap. It's also where the footage question, the one this story opened with, starts to get complicated. Investigators had one real advantage going in. The boat Nolan's friends were using had GPS. That data, pulled by state marine officials, laid the morning out precisely. The dock departure, the arrival at Horn Island, the hours anchored offshore. It also confirmed what his friends had already said. They left the island at 4:31 that afternoon, without him. It's worth pausing on what GPS data actually proves, because it's easy to treat it as more conclusive than it is. It shows where a boat was, and when. It doesn't show who was steering it, what was said on board, or why anyone made the choices they made at each stop. It answers where. It doesn't answer why. That distinction matters, because what the GPS revealed next raises exactly the kind of question it can't, on its own, resolve. What the GPS data revealed next is where the timeline stops being simple. The boat didn't go straight back to its home dock. At 5:52 that evening, it turned into Fort Bayou, the same heavily developed, heavily monitored waterway this story opened with, lined with marinas, a yacht club, and homes worth millions of dollars. It didn't come back out for 14 minutes. Later that same night, the boat was pulled from the water entirely and driven overland to its owner's home, on a night when Nolan's family had already reported him missing. No one has ever publicly accounted for those 14 minutes, and when the boat finally did make it home, the group that stepped off it had Nolan's phone with them. They didn't have Nolan. That's the detail that turned this from a tragic accident into an active investigation. And it's also the detail that explains why the camera question matters as much as it does. If there's a stretch of water anywhere on this coast where a boat's movements might have been caught on video, it's exactly the stretch this one entered that evening. So, has any of that footage actually been pulled? That question is worth subscribing for on its own. What comes next isn't another theory about that footage. It's the difference between what people assume happened to it and what's actually been confirmed. Here's what's actually been done, as opposed to what's been assumed. On July 20th, the same day hundreds of people gathered in Ocean Springs for Nolan's funeral, attorneys working with the family sent formal evidence preservation letters to nearly a dozen people and institutions. Several of Nolan's friends, their families, local law enforcement, the county prosecutor, the coroner, the state medical examiner's office. The letters ran almost 20 categories deep, ordering every recipient to preserve anything that might be relevant to a future legal claim, and to immediately stop any automatic deletion running on their phones, computers, or cameras. It sounds, on first read, like the kind of legal step that would cover a marina's security system or a private dock's camera. It isn't, at least not that we can confirm. Those letters went to specific people already connected to the case, instructing them to preserve what was already in their own possession. Nobody has publicly confirmed that a single business, yacht club, or homeowner along that stretch of water has actually been served with anything. That's not proof it hasn't happened somewhere quietly. It's simply the edge of what's actually confirmed, and everything past that edge is still an open question, not a settled fact. 9 days later, the legal effort took a different, more specific shape. An attorney representing Nolan's mother filed 5 formal subpoenas, not preservation letters this time, but court-ordered demands, against 5 major technology companies, seeking account activity, messages, login records, and location data tied to Nolan's accounts. The filing came after his mother said that when his phone was finally returned to the family, content that had once existed on his social media accounts appeared to be missing. She's called that suspicious. At least one friend has pushed back, saying he has no knowledge of anyone deleting anything, and that no one had access to the phone between the time it left the boat and the time it reached the truck that carried it home. Neither account has been proven. Both are simply where that particular thread currently stands. So, an aggressive, well-documented legal effort exists to preserve digital evidence, phones, cloud accounts, the platforms Nolan used to talk to the people in his life. A parallel effort to preserve the physical camera network along the water his friend's boat passed through twice that evening doesn't appear to exist publicly, or hasn't been reported if it does. And commercial security footage doesn't wait around for anyone to sort that out. Most systems overwrite themselves automatically, somewhere between 30 and 90 days after recording. July 4th is now well past the short end of that window, and closing in on the long end. If footage from that stretch of water mattered, and nobody requested it in time, it may already be gone, erased not by any decision, but by equipment doing exactly what it was built to do, on a schedule that has nothing to do with this case. The legal maneuvering hasn't only moved in one direction. As public attention on this case grew, several people connected to the boat trip, none of them charged with anything, retained their own attorneys to respond to what they describe as months of online accusation. At least one attorney has said publicly that his client's family intends to pursue defamation claims against anonymous accounts, and described hiring a private investigator to help identify them. Cease and desist letters have reportedly gone out to at least one online commentator. It's an uncomfortable fact sitting alongside everything else in this case. People who've been cleared of any wrongdoing have concluded that defending themselves now requires lawyers of their own. That same online intensity hasn't stayed contained to legal letters. As of this recording, 3 separate people, none of them known to Nolan, his family, or anyone who was on that boat, have been criminally charged in 3 separate incidents for threatening witnesses and officials connected to this case. One is accused of calling 2 witnesses and threatening to kill them and their families. Another is accused of phoning in a bomb threat to a county government office. A third was charged earlier for threats against a local judge, whose only connection to this case is that one of her own children happened to be among the friends on Horn Island that day. Nolan's mother has said she's personally received hate mail throughout this process. At one point, an AI-generated video misrepresenting her circulated online before it was identified and debunked. The FBI is now investigating the pattern at the federal level. Part of what's fueled that intensity is something this story would be incomplete without naming directly: race. Nolan Wells was black. Nearly everyone he traveled to the island with that day was white. In a state with its own long, well-documented history around cases like this one, that fact shaped how quickly this story spread, and how much distrust attached itself to every delay in the official process. Nolan's family and their attorneys have said publicly that they believe race is part of why answers have come so slowly. Investigators and the district attorney's office maintain that the pace simply reflects standard procedure for any unexplained death. Both of those things are part of the honest picture of how this case became what it is. Strip away the legal filings and the public records for a moment, and 2 competing readings of this case have emerged, and it's worth being fair to both. One holds that this is, at its core, a tragic accident, a warm night, a strong current, a young man who stayed behind in water that has claimed people before, with nothing in the physical evidence so far pointing anywhere else. The other holds that too many pieces still don't fit that explanation cleanly. The unexplained 14 minutes, the missing content on his phone, the conflicting accounts of his final conversation, the delay in a full public accounting. Neither side has the kind of proof that would let it call the matter closed. That's not a failure of the investigation. It's an accurate description of where the evidence currently sits. As for where the investigation actually stands, the state medical examiner's office has completed its formal autopsy, but under Jackson County's standard procedure, the findings won't be released publicly until the case goes before a grand jury, which reviews the evidence before any decision is made about criminal charges. The family's independent autopsy has already concluded, cause and manner of death listed as undetermined, pending further investigation, with the available evidence described as insufficient to rule out foul play. That phrase is doing careful, deliberate work. It is not evidence of foul play. It's an acknowledgement that the door hasn't been closed in either direction. Investigators have interviewed roughly 60 witnesses so far. The FBI has assisted in reviewing digital evidence. Attorneys for the family have said forensic audio specialists are conducting a fuller review of the emergency call placed from the boat that afternoon, and that ocean engineering experts are separately examining how Nolan's body came to be found exactly where it was, given the tidal patterns moving through that part of the Gulf at the time. A detail Ben Crump has said publicly still doesn't fully add up to him. A separate, independent analytical review, cross-referencing photographs, GPS data, and witness accounts, has concluded that a real, material gap remains in the timeline between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and the recovery of his body 2 days later. It doesn't say what filled that gap. It simply confirms, in more careful terms than most of what circulates online, that the gap is real. And just this past week, in a detail that says as much about this case as anything else in it, attorneys for 3 of the friends who were with Nolan that day confirmed that their clients had gone back to Horn Island themselves, to walk the ground and look at the layout firsthand. Young men who were present for one of the most scrutinized days in recent Mississippi history, returning to the actual scene on their own, entirely outside any official process, because that process still hasn't told the public, or apparently told them, what it's actually found. 5 weeks of subpoenas, threats, competing autopsies, and independent reviews, and the questions this story opened with are, if anything, sharper now than they were at the start. This case isn't over, and neither is our coverage of it. If you want to see where it goes from here, subscribe now, because what follows is where things actually stand tonight, not where the theories want them to be. Here's the honest place this story has to land, at least for now. Nothing about Nolan Wells' case has actually been resolved. No charges have been filed in connection with his death. The state's autopsy is finished, but its findings stay sealed until prosecutors take the case to a grand jury. And there's no public timeline for when that happens. The family's independent autopsy leaves the same open door, cause and manner of death undetermined. And the question this story opened with, the one about a boat that spent 14 unexplained minutes surrounded by some of the most heavily monitored waterfront on the Mississippi coast, still doesn't have a public answer. As of tonight, nobody outside a small circle of investigators knows whether that footage was ever requested, whether it still exists, or whether it quietly expired somewhere on a 30-day cycle, while everyone was still arguing about whether to ask for it. What is confirmed is smaller, but it's not nothing. A boat left a dock at 9:56 in the morning and returned to it, without one of the people who'd left on it, at 6:06 that evening. After an unexplained stop nobody has accounted for, 2 independent legal efforts, one aimed at digital records, one aimed at physical evidence already in specific people's possession, are actively underway. 3 strangers, with no connection to Nolan or his family, are now facing criminal charges for threats made in this case's name. And a family that buried their 18-year-old son 5 weeks ago is still waiting for someone to tell them what happened to him. What remains unknown is, honestly, most of it. What was actually said in the last conversation Nolan had with the people he stayed behind with? What happened during those 14 minutes in Fort Bayou? Why content that once existed on his phone appears to be missing? Whether any of the camera footage along that corridor still exists to be reviewed at all? Whether the accident theory or the unresolved questions theory is closer to the truth? None of that is a failure of this video. It's an accurate description of where a genuinely active investigation stands, 5 weeks in. What's happened since goes beyond the legal filings. Hundreds of people packed into Center Point Church in Ocean Springs for Nolan's funeral. Family, teammates, coaches, classmates, and people who'd never met him, but had followed his story anyway. Actor Tyler Perry covered the funeral costs for the family. Southwest Mississippi Community College brought in counselors for his teammates, the same players who'd been getting ready to start a season with him just days before he disappeared. His parents have said they intend to start a foundation in his name, something lasting, built out of a summer that took everything from them. His mother, Christine Wansley, has kept showing up publicly through all of it, thanking the people who've sent support, and at the same time asking, over and over, for real answers about her son. Both of those things, gratitude and pursuit, have existed side by side in nearly everything she's said since July. There's a detail worth sitting with, one more time, before this story ends. Nearly everyone who knew Nolan Wells describes the same instinct in him, a habit of pointing attention somewhere other than himself, sharing his own recruiting spotlight with his younger brother, celebrating a game he didn't get to play in like it was his own win, making sure the freshmen on his team felt like they belonged before he worried about himself. 5 weeks later, more attention is pointed at his name than at almost anyone else in the state of Mississippi. Cameras, subpoenas, national headlines, a case being picked apart night after night by channels just like this one. It's hard not to notice that the one person who spent his life redirecting the spotlight is the one person no longer here to do it. That's where this case sits tonight. Not resolved, not forgotten. Still open, still being fought over in courtrooms and comment sections at the same time. Still waiting on a piece of footage, or a grand jury, or a single confirmed fact solid enough to finally settle what happened in the hours after his friend's boat pulled away from Horn Island without him. Whatever that answer eventually turns out to be, one thing about this case hasn't changed since the night his mother first reported him missing, and it isn't going to change no matter what any camera eventually shows. A family is still waiting to bring their son's story to an actual close. Everything else, every subpoena, every theory, every camera pointed at that water, exists only because that one fact is still true.